As you may have heard, Prince Charles has tested positive for coronavirus. This is very sad, distressing news, but it's not entirely surprising. In January and February alone, he had nearly 80 engagements, making him our busiest royal. That's a lot of meet and greets, with a lot of potentially unwashed hands. It's striking how many of the rich and famous have tested positive for COVID-19 so far, whether it's members of the royal family, government ministers, prime ministers' wives, actors, or even imprisoned Hollywood moguls. And we know from history that contagion doesn't care who you are. When most of us think of pandemics and infestations, we're transported back to our school books and pictures of the Black Death wreaking havoc across medieval Europe. The plague arrived in Italy and bang, very quickly it had wiped out a third of Europe's population. And it kept reoccurring. It killed the English King Richard II's wife, Anne of Bohemia, and it was said he was so distressed he pulled down the manor house where she had died. The plague-ridden Middle Ages changed the way we responded to disease with some innovative new public health measures. For instance, we introduced quarantines, self-isolation in other words, which is what we're experiencing right now, and it's why I'm in my sitting room being filmed by my 11-year-old. There were also cordons sanitaires. They were barriers to limit movement, and yes, in some cases, the state relied on the army. And if you look at what's happening across Europe at the moment, you could be mistaken for thinking we've gone back in time. The Black Death wasn't the only contagious disease that British royals fell victim to. Tudor King Henry VIII did everything he could to protect his only son Edward. He made sure he was in a clean environment and he wasn't allowed to meet unwell people. But by the time Edward was 14, he reckoned he had both smallpox and measles, and weakened, he died a year later of tuberculosis. Another Tudor royal, Queen Elizabeth I, contracted smallpox in 1562. The pox was a big killer, and if you survived, it could leave quite nasty scarring. The Queen lived, but it might account for her rather peculiar makeup later in life. Since Tudor times, medication, sanitation have improved vastly. But let's not forget that industrialisation and increased travel mean that infections can spread far further, far faster. Most of us know that Queen Victoria spent a lot of her life in black, mourning the premature death of her husband, Albert. He died of typhoid fever, aged 42. Less well known is that she also lost a grandson, Albert Victor, to Russian flu in the 1890s. Had Albert lived, his younger brother George wouldn't have inherited the throne, i.e. there would have been no George V, and we wouldn't currently have Queen Elizabeth sitting on the throne today. Luckily her grandfather George was made of fairly sturdy stuff because there was another epidemic on the way. The Spanish flu. It's a virus we still don't fully understand. It was particularly lethal for healthy young adults. Thankfully, it didn't sneak into Buckingham Palace, but the Spanish King Alfonso XIII contracted it, and it very nearly knocked out our British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who was on a respirator by September 1918. History tells us we have a lot of practice with contagion. In the past, our businesses have been shut down, our cities quarantined, and our royal figureheads imperilled. And we also know that infection doesn't care if you're a prince or a pauper. In fact, Prince Charles, as our hardest working royal, meeting lots of people lots of the time, was at greater risk. And that's where our thoughts are right now, with him and his wife Camilla, and all other families who find themselves in a similar situation and have tested positive for coronavirus in recent weeks.